The text message came at 2:37 in the morning, the blue glow of my phone cutting through the darkness of my dorm room like a knife. I blinked at the screen, my eyes adjusting to the sudden brightness as I read the words that would change everything between Marcus and me. Can't sleep again. Mind coming over. I stared at the message for a long moment, my thumb hovering over the keyboard. This was the third time this month that Marcus had texted me in the middle of the night, asking me to come to his room. Each time, I'd found him pacing his small dorm space, running his hands through his dark hair, his usual confident demeanor replaced by something raw and vulnerable that made my chest tighten in ways I tried not to examine too closely. On my way, I typed back, already throwing off my covers and reaching for the hoodie draped over my desk chair. The hallway was eerily quiet as I made my way to Marcus's room 3 doors down. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in harsh shadows that seemed to dance as I walked. My bare feet made soft padding sounds against the cold linoleum, and I was suddenly aware of how thin my pajama pants were, how exposed I felt walking through the dormitory at this hour. I knocked softly on his door, the sound barely audible in the silence. Within seconds, it swung open to reveal Marcus standing there in nothing but a pair of gray sweatpants that hung low on his hips. His chest was bare, and I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his muscles seemed coiled tight like a spring ready to snap. His brown eyes were wide, almost wild, and there were dark circles beneath them that spoke of too many sleepless nights. "Thanks for coming," he said, his voice rough with exhaustion as he stepped aside to let me in. "I know it's late, Don't worry about it," I interrupted, closing the door behind me and turning to face him. "What's going on? You look like you haven't slept in days." Marcus ran a hand through his hair, the gesture so familiar it made something ache in my chest. We'd been friends since freshman year, bonding over late-night study sessions and a shared love of terrible horror movies. He was everything I wasn't confident where I was anxious, outgoing where I was reserved, effortlessly charming in a way that drew people to him like moths to a flame. He was also completely, utterly straight, something I'd learned early on when he'd spent an entire evening describing in vivid detail his attraction to our chemistry lab partner, Sarah. "I don't know what's wrong with me," he said, starting to pace again. "Every time I close my eyes, my mind just races. I keep thinking about everything, School, my parents' expectations, what I'm supposed to do after graduation. It's like my brain won't shut off." I watched him move around the small room, noting the way his hands clenched and unclenched at his sides, the way he kept glancing at his bed as if it were an enemy to be conquered. His room was messier than usual, clothes scattered across the floor, textbooks stacked haphazardly on his desk. The air smelled like him, that mixture of cologne and something uniquely Marcus that always made me feel slightly dizzy. "Have you tried talking to someone about it?" I asked, settling into his desk chair. "Like a counselor or something?" He shook his head, finally stopping his pacing to look at me directly. "I can't. You know how my dad feels about that kind of thing. He'd think I was weak." I knew Marcus's father well enough from the few times I'd met him during family visits. A stern man who expected excellence in everything, who'd mapped out Marcus's entire future before he'd even graduated high school. Pre-med, then medical school, then a prestigious residency, all leading to the kind of successful practice that would make the family proud. There was no room in that plan for anxiety or sleepless nights or anything that might be perceived as failure. "You're not weak," I said quietly. "You're just stressed. It's normal." Marcus looked at me for a long moment, something shifting in his expression. "You always know what to say," he said, his voice softer now. "That's why I called you. You're the only person who makes me feel calm." The words hit me like a physical blow, and I had to look away to hide the flush I could feel creeping up my neck. This was dangerous territory, the kind of moment that made me remember why I'd been so careful to keep my feelings for Marcus locked away in the deepest part of my heart. He trusted me, relied on me, and the last thing I wanted was to complicate our friendship with my own complicated emotions. "I'm glad I can help," I managed, my voice steady despite the way my pulse was racing. Marcus moved to his bed, sitting on the edge and dropping his head into his hands. "I'm so tired," he whispered. "I just want to sleep, but every time I try, it's like my body won't let me. Like I'm too wound up, too tense." I studied his profile in the dim light from his desk lamp, taking in the exhaustion etched in every line of his face. Without really thinking about it, I stood up and moved to sit beside him on the bed, the mattress dipping slightly under our combined weight. Maybe you need to try something different, I suggested. Instead of fighting it, just let yourself relax. Focus on breathing or on something peaceful. He turned to look at me, and suddenly we were sitting much closer than I'd realized. I could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes, could smell the faint scent of his shampoo. My mouth went dry, and I had to resist the urge to lean away, to put some distance between us before I did something stupid. Will you stay? He asked suddenly, the words tumbling out in a rush. I mean, just until I fall asleep. I know it's weird, but I think having someone here might help. You don't have to do anything, just be here. The request caught me off guard, and for a moment I couldn't speak. The rational part of my brain was screaming warnings, telling me that this was a terrible idea, that lying in bed with my straight best friend who I'd been in love with for over 2 years was a recipe for disaster. But the look in his eyes, the vulnerability there, made it impossible to say no. Okay, I heard myself say, if you think it'll help. Relief flooded his features, and he actually smiled for the first time since I'd arrived. Thank you, he said. I owe you big time. He moved to turn off the desk lamp, plunging the room into darkness except for the faint glow from the streetlight outside his window. I heard the rustle of sheets as he got into bed, and after a moment of hesitation, I kicked off my slippers and climbed in beside him. The bed was smaller than I'd expected, a standard dorm twin that forced us to lie closer together than either of us probably intended. I could feel the heat radiating from his body, could hear his breathing in the darkness. I lay on my back, staring at the ceiling, trying to keep my own breathing steady and even. This is nice, Marcus murmured beside me, his voice already sounding drowsy. I feel better already. I turned my head slightly to look at him, though I could barely make out his profile in the darkness. Good, I whispered back. Just try to clear your mind. Think about something peaceful. What do you think about when you can't sleep? He asked, shifting slightly so that his shoulder brushed against mine. The honest answer was that I thought about him, about moments like this that could never really happen, about all the things I wanted to say but never could. Instead, I said, usually the ocean. I imagine lying on a beach somewhere, listening to the waves. That sounds nice, he said, his voice getting softer. Tell me about it. So I did. I described an imaginary beach, the feel of warm sand beneath our bodies, the sound of waves rolling in and out in a steady rhythm. I talked about the salt air and the cry of seagulls, about the sun warming our skin and the endless expanse of blue water stretching to the horizon. As I spoke, I felt Marcus's breathing begin to slow and deepen beside me. Keep talking, he murmured when I paused, and I could hear that he was right on the edge of sleep. I continued the story, describing how the waves seemed to wash away all our worries, how the rhythm of the ocean was like a lullaby that made everything else fade away. Gradually, Marcus's breathing evened out completely, and I knew he'd finally fallen asleep. I should have left then. That would have been the smart thing to do, to slip out quietly and return to my own room. But something kept me there, lying in the darkness beside him, listening to the steady sound of his breathing. In sleep, he looked younger somehow, the stress lines around his eyes smoothed away, his face peaceful in a way I rarely saw when he was awake. Without meaning to, I found myself studying the curve of his jaw, the way his dark hair fell across his forehead. In the dim light from the window, I could see the rise and fall of his chest, the way his lips were slightly parted as he breathed. He was beautiful, and lying here beside him felt like both a gift and a torture. I must have dozed off at some point, because the next thing I knew, pale morning light was filtering through the window, and I was being pulled from sleep by the realization that something had changed during the night. Marcus had moved closer in his sleep, and now his arm was draped across my chest, his face pressed against my shoulder. His leg was tangled with mine, and I could feel every inch of his warm body pressed against my side. My heart started racing as I tried to figure out how to extract myself without waking him. This was exactly the kind of situation I'd been afraid of, the kind of intimacy that would only make my feelings for him harder to ignore. But as I started to carefully lift his arm, Marcus stirred, making a soft sound of protest in his sleep. "Don't go," he mumbled, his voice thick with sleep as his arm tightened around me. "Stay." I froze, unsure whether he was actually awake or just talking in his sleep. His breathing was still deep and even, suggesting he wasn't fully conscious, but his grip on me was firm and deliberate. I found myself relaxing back into the mattress, telling myself that this was just about helping a friend, that the way my body was responding to his touch didn't mean anything. Marcus shifted again, and suddenly his face was even closer to mine, his breath warm against my neck. I could feel every point where our bodies touched, the weight of his arm across my chest, the way his leg was pressed between mine. It was overwhelming and perfect and completely wrong all at the same time. "Marcus," I whispered, thinking I should wake him up, should put an end to this before it went any further. But instead of pulling away, he moved even closer, his nose brushing against the sensitive skin just below my ear. "Feels good," he murmured, and I couldn't tell if he was awake or asleep, if he knew what he was doing, or if this was just some unconscious response. My entire body was on fire, every nerve ending alive with awareness of him. I could feel myself responding in ways that I definitely shouldn't be, my body betraying me even as my mind tried to maintain some semblance of control. This was Marcus, my straight best friend who trusted me, who had asked me here because he needed help sleeping, not because he wanted anything more. "Marcus." I tried again, my voice barely audible. This time he did stir, lifting his head slightly to look at me. His eyes were heavy with sleep, unfocused in the early morning light. For a moment, we just stared at each other, and I could see the exact moment when he became fully aware of our position, of how intimately we were tangled together. But instead of pulling away, instead of the awkward apology I was expecting, something else flickered in his eyes. Something that looked almost like hunger, like want. His gaze dropped to my lips for just a second before meeting my eyes again, and suddenly the air between us felt charged with possibility. "I slept," he said quietly, his voice rough with sleep. "I actually slept." "Good," I managed, though my voice came out as barely more than a whisper. "That's good." We were still pressed together, his arms still across my chest, his face only inches from mine. I could see every detail of his features in the morning light, could count his eyelashes, could see the faint stubble along his jaw. He was so close that if I just tilted my head slightly, our lips would touch. "Thank you," he said, and there was something in his voice that I'd never heard before, something soft and vulnerable and almost intimate. "For staying. For helping me sleep." "Of course," I said, though I wasn't sure how I managed to form the words when my entire world had narrowed down to this moment, to the feeling of his body against mine and the way he was looking at me like he was seeing something new. Marcus's hand moved slightly, his fingers brushing against my chest through my thin t-shirt, and I had to bite back a gasp at the sensation. The touch was light, almost hesitant, but it sent electricity shooting through my entire body. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice so quiet I had to strain to hear him. "About a lot of things. About why I can't sleep, about what's been bothering me so much." I waited, not trusting myself to speak, my heart pounding so hard I was sure he could hear it. "I think," he continued, his fingers still moving in small, absent circles against my chest, "I think maybe I've been fighting something. Something I didn't want to admit, even to myself." The words hung in the air between us, loaded with possibility and danger. I wanted to ask what he meant, wanted to push for clarification, but I was terrified of breaking whatever spell had settled over us, of saying the wrong thing and ruining everything. Instead, I just looked at him, trying to read the expression in his eyes, trying to understand what was happening between us. His hand was still moving against my chest, the touch becoming more deliberate now, more intentional. When his fingers found the hem of my shirt and slipped underneath to touch bare skin, I couldn't hold back a soft gasp. "Is this okay?" he asked, his voice barely audible, his eyes searching mine for some sign of permission or rejection. I should have said no. I should have reminded him that he was straight, that this was just confusion brought on by exhaustion and vulnerability, that we were friends and nothing more. But the word that came out of my mouth was, yes. His hand spread flat against my chest, palm warm against my skin, and I could feel my heart racing beneath his touch. He was watching my face carefully, as if gauging my reaction, and whatever he saw there seemed to encourage him because his hand began to move, exploring the planes of my chest with a curiosity that made my breath catch. "I've never," he started, then stopped, shaking his head. "I mean, I've never thought about, with a guy. We don't have to do anything, I said quickly, though the words felt like they were being torn from my throat. If you're not sure, we should stop. But he shook his head again, more firmly this time. No, I want to. I've been thinking about it, about you, more than I should, more than I understood until now. The confession hit me like a physical blow, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. This couldn't be happening. This was the kind of fantasy I'd indulged in during my darkest, most private moments, the kind of impossible scenario that I'd always known would never become reality. Marcus, I said, his name a question and a plea all at once. I know it's crazy, he said, his hand still moving against my skin, sending waves of sensation through my entire body. I know it doesn't make sense, but lying here with you, feeling this close to someone for the first time in so long, I can't ignore it anymore. He shifted closer, if that was even possible, his legs sliding between mine in a way that made me gasp. I could feel that he was aroused, could feel the evidence of his desire pressing against my hip, and the realization that he wanted this as much as I did was almost overwhelming. I trust you, he whispered, his lips so close to my ear that I could feel his breath. I've never trusted anyone the way I trust you. And I want to see what this feels like. His lips brushed against my neck, just the barest touch, but it was enough to make me arch against him involuntarily. The sound I made was embarrassing, needy, and desperate, but Marcus seemed to like it because he did it again, pressing a slightly more deliberate kiss to the sensitive skin just below my ear. Tell me what you want, he murmured against my neck, his voice rough with desire. Tell me what to do. I couldn't form words, couldn't think beyond the sensation of his lips on my skin and his hands exploring my body. This was everything I'd ever wanted and everything I'd been afraid to hope for, and the intensity of it was almost too much to bear. Touch me. I finally managed, the words barely audible. Please. His hand slid lower, fingers trailing over my stomach, and I could feel every muscle in my body tensing with anticipation. When he reached the waistband of my pajama pants, he paused, looking at me with an expression that was equal parts nervous and determined. Are you sure? He asked, and I could hear the uncertainty in his voice, the fear that maybe he was crossing a line he couldn't uncross. Instead of answering with words, I reached up and cupped his face with my hand, my thumb brushing across his cheekbone. He leaned into the touch, his eyes closing for a moment, and when he opened them again, I could see that some decision had been made. He kissed me then, soft and tentative at first, as if he was testing the waters. His lips were warm and slightly chapped, and the taste of him was better than anything I'd ever imagined. When I kissed him back, he made a soft sound of surprise and pleasure that went straight through me. The kiss deepened gradually, becoming more confident as we found our rhythm together. His tongue traced the seam of my lips, and when I opened for him, he explored my mouth with a thoroughness that left me breathless. I could feel years of suppressed desire pouring out of me. All the nights I'd lain awake thinking about this exact moment, all the times I'd watched him and wondered what it would be like to touch him, to taste him, to have him want me back. His hand finally moved past the waistband of my pants, and the first touch of his fingers against me made me break away from the kiss with a gasp. He watched my face as he touched me, his expression fascinated and hungry, as if he was memorizing every reaction. You're so responsive, he murmured, his voice full of wonder. I love watching you react to me. I wanted to tell him that it was because it was him, that I'd been dreaming of this for so long that every touch felt magnified, but I couldn't form coherent sentences with his hand moving against me like that. Instead, I reached for him, my own hand sliding down his chest to the waistband of his sweatpants. He sucked in a sharp breath when I touched him, his hips jerking involuntarily. He was hard and warm in my hand, and the knowledge that I was the one who had done this to him, that his body was responding to me this way, was almost enough to undo me completely. God, he breathed, his head falling back as I stroked him. That feels incredible. We moved together in the pale morning light, hands exploring and learning, discovering what made the other gasp and arch and moan. Marcus was surprisingly vocal, whispering my name and soft encouragements that made my heart race even faster. When he wrapped his hand around both of us together, the sensation was so intense that I had to bite down on his shoulder to keep from crying out. I want to make you feel good, he said, his voice rough with desire. Tell me how. I guided his hand, showed him the rhythm and pressure that I liked, and he was a quick learner, adapting his touch until I was writhing beneath him, completely lost to sensation. He seemed fascinated by my responses, by the way I moved against him, by the sounds I couldn't help making. "You're beautiful like this," he murmured, his lips brushing against my jaw. "So beautiful. I can't believe I never saw it before." The words pushed me closer to the edge, and when he kissed me again, deep and hungry and desperate, I felt myself falling apart in his arms. He followed me over a moment later, his body tensing against mine as he buried his face in my neck, my name a broken whisper on his lips. We lay there afterward, breathing hard, our bodies still tangled together. The reality of what had just happened was starting to sink in, and I could feel anxiety beginning to creep in around the edges of the euphoria. This changed everything between us, and I had no idea what it meant or where we went from here. Marcus was quiet beside me, his arms still around me, but his body tense in a way that suggested he was having similar thoughts. When he finally spoke, his voice was careful, measured. "That was," he started, then stopped, seeming to search for the right words. "I didn't expect it to be like that." "Like what?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. He was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice was soft, almost wondering. "Like coming home," he said. "Like something I didn't know I was missing." The words made my chest tight with hope and fear in equal measure. I wanted to believe them, wanted to think that this meant something more than just experimentation or curiosity, but I was terrified of reading too much into it. "Marcus," I started, not sure what I wanted to say. "I know," he said quietly. "I know this is complicated. I know it changes things." He turned to look at me, and I could see the uncertainty in his eyes, the fear that maybe he'd made a mistake. But there was something else there too, something that looked like wonder, like the beginning of understanding. "I don't regret it," he said firmly. "Whatever this means, whatever happens next, I don't regret it." I wanted to tell him that I'd been in love with him for years, that this wasn't just physical for me, that my feelings ran deeper than he could possibly understand. But the words stuck in my throat, held back by the fear that it would be too much, too soon, that I'd scare him away before we had a chance to figure out what this was. "Instead," I said, "neither do I." He smiled then, the first real smile I'd seen from him in weeks, and leaned down to kiss me again. This kiss was different from the others, softer and more tender, as if he was trying to communicate something that words couldn't express. "I should probably get ready for class," he said when we broke apart, though he made no move to get up. "Probably," I agreed, though I was equally reluctant to leave the cocoon of warmth and intimacy we'd created. But eventually, reality intruded, and we had to untangle ourselves and face the day. As I gathered my clothes and prepared to leave, Marcus caught my hand, his fingers intertwining with mine. "Will you come back tonight?" he asked, and there was vulnerability in the question that made my heart ache. "I mean, if you want to. No pressure." I squeezed his hand, unable to keep the smile off my face. "Yes," I said. "I'll come back." The rest of the day passed in a blur of classes and routine activities, but my mind was entirely occupied with thoughts of Marcus and what had happened between us. I found myself replaying every moment, every touch and kiss and whispered word, trying to make sense of this new reality. I saw him briefly at lunch, surrounded by his usual crowd of friends, and the normalcy of it was jarring after the intimacy we'd shared that morning. He caught my eye across the cafeteria and smiled, a small, private smile that was just for me, and I felt my cheeks heat with the memory of his hands on my skin. That evening, I found myself standing outside his door again, my heart racing with anticipation and nervousness. When he opened it, he was wearing a different pair of sweatpants and a t-shirt, but his hair was still messy and his eyes had that same vulnerable quality that had drawn me to him in the first place. "Hi," he said softly, stepping aside to let me in. "Hi," I replied, suddenly feeling shy despite everything that had happened between us. The room looked the same as it had that morning, but somehow everything felt different. There was a charge in the air, an awareness that hadn't been there before. Marcus closed the door behind me and turned to face me, and for a moment we just looked at each other, both of us remembering. "I've been thinking about this morning all day," he said finally, his voice quiet but steady. "About you. About us." "Me too," I admitted. He moved closer, close enough that I could smell his cologne, could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes. I want to do it again, he said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. But I also want to talk. I want to understand what this means. I nodded, relief flooding through me at his words. I'd like that too. We sat on his bed, facing each other, and for a while we just talked. He told me about the confusion he'd been feeling, about the way his attraction to me had been building without him really understanding what it was. He talked about his fear of his father's reaction, about the way this challenged everything he'd thought he knew about himself. I found myself opening up in ways I never had before, telling him about the years I'd spent hiding my feelings, about the pain of loving someone who I thought could never love me back. I told him about the nights I'd lain awake thinking about him, about the way I'd learned to push down my desires and pretend they didn't exist. I'm sorry, he said when I finished, his hand reaching out to cover mine. I'm sorry you had to go through that alone. I wish I'd understood sooner. It's not your fault, I said. You couldn't have known. But I could have been more aware, he insisted. I could have paid more attention to what you were going through. The conversation continued late into the night, interspersed with kisses and touches that grew more confident as the hours passed. Marcus was eager to learn, to explore this new aspect of himself, and I was more than willing to guide him. We took our time, discovering each other's bodies with a thoroughness that left us both breathless and satisfied. In the days that followed, we fell into a new routine. Marcus still texted me when he couldn't sleep, but now it meant something different. Now it meant stolen hours in the darkness, whispered confessions and gentle touches, the gradual building of something deeper than friendship. We were careful around others, maintaining the facade of simple friendship while we figured out what we were to each other. But in private, in the safety of his room or mine, we were free to explore this new dynamic between us. Marcus proved to be an attentive and enthusiastic partner, approaching our physical relationship with the same intensity he brought to everything else in his life. He asked questions, paid attention to my responses, and seemed genuinely fascinated by the way our bodies fit together. I never understood, he said one night as we lay tangled together after making love, how it could feel like this. How being with someone could be so complete. I traced patterns on his chest with my fingertip, marveling at the fact that I was allowed to touch him like this, that he wanted me to. It's not always like this, I said honestly. It's like this because it's you. He caught my hand, bringing it to his lips to press a kiss to my palm. I'm falling in love with you, he said quietly, the words hitting me like a physical blow. I know that's probably scary to hear, given everything, but I needed you to know. I stared at him, hardly daring to believe what I'd heard. Say it again, I whispered. He smiled, that beautiful smile that had been making my heart race for years. I love you, he said, more confidently this time. I'm in love with you, and I don't care how complicated that makes things. I love you too, I said, the words I'd been holding back for so long finally finding their voice. I've loved you for so long, Marcus. So long. He kissed me then, deep and passionate and full of promise, and I knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever obstacles we'd have to face, we'd face them together. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of discovery and adjustment. Marcus had to come to terms with this new understanding of his sexuality, had to reconcile it with the image he'd always had of himself. There were moments of doubt, times when the weight of expectation and fear threatened to overwhelm him, but he never wavered in his commitment to us, to what we were building together. We talked about the future, about what it would mean to be together in a world that might not always understand or accept us. Marcus worried about his family, about his father's reaction, about the impact this might have on his carefully planned career. But he also talked about the peace he'd found with me, about the way I made him feel whole in a way he'd never experienced before. You saved me, he said one night as we lay in the darkness, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on my skin. I was drowning in all those expectations, all that pressure to be perfect, and you saved me. We saved each other, I corrected, because it was true. He'd given me something I'd never thought I'd have, had made me believe that I was worthy of love, that my feelings mattered. The sleep problems that had brought us together in the first place gradually disappeared. Marcus slept peacefully now, his body relaxed and content in ways it had never been before. But he still asked me to stay with him most nights, not because he couldn't sleep alone, but because he didn't want to. I sleep better when you're here, he'd say, pulling me closer. Everything's better when you're here. And it was true. Everything was better, brighter, more meaningful with him in my life. The future, which had once seemed uncertain and lonely, now stretched out before us full of possibility. There would be challenges, certainly, obstacles to overcome and difficult conversations to have, but we'd face them together. As I lay there in his arms, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing, I thought about that first night when he'd texted me, desperate and sleepless and reaching out for help. Neither of us could have predicted where that moment would lead, how it would change everything between us. But sometimes the most important journeys begin with a simple request, a moment of vulnerability that opens the door to something beautiful and unexpected. Marcus had asked me to help him sleep, and in doing so, he'd awakened something in both of us that we'd never known was there. Now, as dawn approached and painted the sky in shades of pink and gold, I knew that whatever came next, we'd face it together. My straight friend had become so much more than that, had become the love of my life, my partner, my home. And for the first time in years, I fell asleep easily, peacefully, completely content in the knowledge that I was exactly where I belonged.